All right, let's do it.
All right, let's roll. Well, welcome and good morning, everybody. I'm Dave Rubin, host of the Rubin Report. It takes a lot to get me out of my home state of Florida at the moment, but I got a call from these guys and they said, let's talk immigration. And I thought this would be an interesting opportunity for me because in the 10 or so years that I've been doing my show, I'm mostly known for talking about free speech and talking about big tech and the culture wars, but something clearly has shifted in at least the American psyche. We're going to talk about the European psyche as well, but something really has shifted in the American psyche as it pertains to immigration, really in the last year. And I did a cursory look at my YouTube channel before we started, and I would say almost half of our biggest videos in the last year are immigration related, which is particularly interesting to me because, again, I don't consider immigration something that was top of mind to me until the last year or so. And of course, everyone now is seeing these endless videos that you're usually not seeing on mainstream media. You see them on Fox News, but you're really not seeing them that often on CNN and MSNBC and some of the other places, of countless illegal immigrants, migrants, whatever word you want to use, whatever phrase you want to use, crossing our border. We seemingly don't know where they're coming from, what their intentions are, how they can fit into our culture, or even if they want to fit into our culture, or if they want to rapidly change our culture. And more people are suddenly waking up to this. A few months ago, I had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on my show, and you may remember about 6 months ago, he went down to the southern border and he did a selfie video where he's standing in front of some portion of the border fence. And he just starts asking people where they're coming from. And I think he counted something like 20 to 25 different countries, and it was about 80 people just walking by him. And even RFK, who is a lifelong liberal, you know, the name Kennedy obviously deep within the Democrat Party, and he's no longer a Democrat, I think that was one of the wake-ups for him to realize how radical one of the parties here in America has become, and really what a threat to the nation this unfettered immigration is. I think it's something between 7 and 10 million illegals in about 3 years, which is just completely unsustainable. We all know that. That has nothing to do with racism. It has nothing to do with bigotry or anything else. So the immigration topic has become something that I talk about on the show all the time. I'm very interested in. And I would say, especially in light of some of the world events, probably post-October 7th, it's something that everybody should be thinking about because we need to know who is in our country. It's really as simple as that. You can't have a country if you don't have borders. I think our European friends, and we'll get into this in just a bit, our European friends are really realizing that, 10 years post allowing millions and millions of people in, they now have cultural issues, they have crime issues, and they have social service issues and a litany of other problems. So that's what we're going to dive into for the next hour or so here. I'm going to briefly introduce all of our panelists and then let them say a word about themselves. Matt Mowers, to my left here, is the founding board member of the EU-US Forum and former senior White House advisor to the U.S. Department of State. And Matt, we will kick it off with you. Just a bit about yourself, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate you leaving one swamp to visit another swamp briefly. Our weather is catching up to you down there. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You're probably wondering in part, why are we here? Why do we care about what's happening right now in Europe? Well, beyond the fact that there's EU elections in just a couple of weeks, we know if you look at where the policies that are being adopted by the far left here in the United States have generated, where they started, much of them were started in the European Union. Much of them got their origins from Europe, whether it's socialized medicine, whether it's radical environmental policy that crushes farmers and crushes innovation, whether it's a lot of the immigration policies I know we're going to dive deep into. And so we started the EU-US Forum in order to be a watchdog on those policies, in order to actually ensure that Americans were aware of the same types of policies that are originating out of Brussels, so we can keep an eye on them when they're trying to be utilized by the far left here in the United States to indoctrinate and to really permeate throughout the policy apparatus here in the U.S. And so that's why we're here, and I just appreciate all of you joining us and the incredible panel we have, and thank you again, Dave, for being with us.
My pleasure. Chad Wolf is the former acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. I'm also the executive director at the America First Policy Institute. That's what I do during my days. I think this is an important topic. Obviously, I would say border security, and I think that's an important distinction. We often talk about immigration to describe what's going on, particularly here in the U.S. along our border and even in the EU amongst member states, what's occurring at their border. That is border security and not necessarily immigration. When people think of immigration, they think of legal immigration, how do folks come legally into different countries, and that is certainly one aspect. But what we're experiencing here in the U.S. and again in the EU and certain member countries is actually border security and national sovereignty, and you need to solve that with a different set of solutions than perhaps immigration solutions. So I like to talk about those two things differently. Whether it's border security or immigration, I think it's one of the top 1, 2, or 3 issues that most Americans care about in the lead up to this November. So I think this is an important topic. And during my time, I'll just end on this, during my time in the Trump administration, we interacted a lot with our foreign counterparts, particularly in the EU and elsewhere. And so I have firsthand knowledge about some of their views as it relates to migration, as it relates to border security, as it relates what should we do with refugees and asylees and things of that nature. And so I got to see some of their progressive policies up close and personal in dealing with them on a day-to-day basis.
Joe Grogan is the senior advisor of the EU-US Forum and former assistant to the president for domestic policy.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to see Matt and Chad again, who I had the privilege of working with in the Trump administration. I split my time now in London and Washington, D.C., and a lot of the issues that we see here in the United States are occurring all over Europe, not just in the United Kingdom. And it's not just bad ideas that can come to the United States. I think there's a tremendous amount of foment and anger and frustration throughout Europe and the United Kingdom around immigration, just as we see here in the United States. It's really it is a major cultural issue for Americans to see this and see how their country's being changed, if not by design, then absolute incompetence. I remember when the previous Biden administration chief of staff, Ron Klain, was on CNN when the border was melting down and had the audacity to say, well, we don't know what to do. We're soliciting ideas on how to get this under control. And Chad Wolf is a phone call away, and there's a bunch of other Trump administration people who achieved absolute quiescence on the border by the time President Trump left office. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about immigration today, and I look forward to working with the EU-US Forum on a whole host of issues that affect Europeans and the United States.
Kara Frederick is the director of Tech Policy Center at the Heritage Foundation.
All right, thanks for having me. So the reason why I think I'm here today is to add a bit more color about what counterterrorism looks like, what terrorism threats actually look like. I spent 2010 through 2014 going back and forth to Afghanistan as a civilian intelligence officer working with Tier 1 special operations units to fight the terrorism problem. And then when I was here at home, we were working the terrorism issue as well, with a particular focus on the terrorists who wanted to come here and blow up things here in our homeland and preventing them from doing so by going over there. Now, this is what I see as the biggest blind spot that the Biden administration is either ignoring, as you say, through incompetence, or, let's just leave it at that. The idea is they are exposing the citizens of the United States to potential terrorist activity. As we've seen in spades, especially with the data points, has anyone seen the news stories of the Chechens surveilling the North Carolina Army officer's home? It's things like that that, in my estimation, it's not a matter of if, but when. Given the people that have crossed the southwest border on the terror watch list, we are doing a disservice to everyone, people who did vastly more overseas than I did, but to every young American that we sent over there to keep them from conducting terrorist attacks here. We're doing them a disservice by letting these people walk over the border with impunity. So that is something that I think does not get talked about enough, that does not have enough visibility in the press. And I'm really grateful for the EU-US Forum for actually bringing this to the fore, because, mark my words, this is the national security imperative of the next few years.
And last but not least, James Carafano is the Senior Counselor to the President and EEW Richardson Fellow at the Heritage Foundation.
Well, thanks. First, I want to say thank you for sticking me on the far right of the panel. I feel very comfortable here. I spend most of my time these days at the Heritage Foundation traveling a lot in Europe and a lot in Latin America. And I think what a lot of Americans really don't understand is the tremendous transformation in Europe. The rise of European conservative populism is really unprecedented. It is becoming a massive political force in Europe. And in Latin America, there are many traditional conservative voices. And I often tell Americans, you have to understand, there are people in Europe and Latin America who you have more in common with than people in California and New York. Mm-hmm. And people say, well, that's nice, but the progressive agenda that really is the alternative vector to the future that we're looking at, it really is global, and that's not a tin hat thing. And to combat that, the like-minded countries and populations around the world that share an alternative view, they have to work together to push this. And there is no issue, none, not one issue, that unites conservatives, particularly in Europe and Latin America, more than this issue of immigration and security.
Well, Matt, let me start with you, which is an offshoot of something that James just said right there about this populist movement, because you guys have put out some polling recently showing that really the number one issue for people in Europe right now is the immigration issue. How do you think that, well, first off, I take it you're not surprised by that,
right.
But how do you think it will affect the upcoming election?
It's going to have a dramatic impact, and it's, primarily driven by immigration, but really a lot of the issues, which are the cornerstone of what we focus on. I mean, you ask about government censorship. We asked the question of, and we polled in 5 countries, by the way. We were in Portugal, Italy, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And we asked the question, are you more concerned today than you were previously about government censorship? Over 60% of respondents in most of the countries said yes. We asked, are you concerned that radical policies on and restrictions and regulations on energy is going to be a national security issue, something that we have the same discussion right here in the United States today when we talk about ban on LNG and a whole number of other issues. Over 60% said yes. We then said, do you believe there need to be stronger controls on border security, and are you concerned about illegal migration? Over 75% in almost every single country said yes. In fact, the only country where it was a little bit lower and was still in the high 60s was Italy, and you actually have an ascendant conservative right trying to make some changes right now in immigration already there. And so what it illuminates to us, and you look at then support levels for political parties, there's an ascendant right today, in part because of the policies of these issues. They know that the European Union, and they know that many of the governments in their own countries have failed to address these core issues around individual liberty and the security around border control. And so they're looking for a change. And so that's the reason why you're seeing more conservative parties elevate. In fact, you look at polling right now, the left is, projected to lose a number of seats. The coalition of the right is, or a consortium of the right are expected to gain a number of seats. And that's driven largely because of these issues right now and the polling that we saw. It wasn't totally surprising because we've had these conversations with Europeans now for a significant amount of time. We've heard the outcry. You look at the stories that are coming out of Europe right now, much of them are very similar to the same stories we're hearing here in the US. You're talking about the crime that's committed by illegal migrants. Over half of crimes committed in Germany are by someone who's there illegally. There's been studies that show that almost 77% of rapes have been committed by those who are there illegally. These are stories that are statistics to us when we read them, but they're impacting the everyday lives of citizens in Europe each and every single day. That's going to translate into political action, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Chad, let me ask you, Joe mentioned incompetence. Is there any chance that any of this is just incompetence at this point, whether it's in Europe or here in the United States, that these people simply do not know what they are doing, or is there actually intent behind it?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I think there's obviously intent behind it. I won't rule out incompetence because I see a lot of that, but I will say that they have a plan. They've executed on that plan, and they talk about executing on that plan for the last 3.5 years. And I think you've got to listen carefully because you see a lot of similarities both here in the States and in the EU. They both talk about designing a border security and an immigration system that is consistent with American values or consistent with European values. And so you say, well, that sounds great, but let's actually take a look at what those values are. And as far as I can tell, a couple of values which I think are out of step with both the American citizenry as well as the European is they believe anyone from anywhere should be able to come to the US or to the EU despite what immigration law says. That they have a right to claim asylum. Again, at least in US law, that is not right. It's a discretionary authority. And then if you are here, that you shouldn't be removed. Almost under any circumstance should you be removed. These are values that I think are out of touch with the American public. But this is why we see both here in the US, the worst historic border crisis that we have ever seen. It's why most people are talking about it. And we see similarities to what they've experienced in the EU going back to 2015 and 2016, and they still have some of these policies. Although member states, it's funny, if you look at member states, particularly Hungary and others, they are pushing back. They understand the consequences of it, and if they are on the front lines of it, they want more border security. They want stricter controls. And so I think you see a push-pull there, very much like you see here in the States when you look at the state of Texas and what Governor Abbott's trying to do in the state of Texas to secure his border because the federal government, in this case, has refused to do that. And so you see some push and pull there as you do with some of the member countries in the EU. But to answer your question, I think it's a plan that they've had. I don't know that they thought it would spiral out of control as much as it has here in the US, but it is certainly, they talk about it, they issue press releases about it. They're very proud of their unlawful use of parole authority and how many people they're bringing into the country each and every month. So this is not anything they kind of stumbled into. This has been a plan.
Let me ask you one follow-up on that. What would be one thing if you just had your old gig back? If they just handed you the job again and you could walk into the office, if there was just one thing you could do to stem some of this right now, what would it be?
So it's a very easy question that's very difficult to answer. It's not just one thing, but I think you have to let your DHS law enforcement, particularly Border Patrol law enforcement, do their job. ICE law enforcement do their job. So you let the men and women of the Border Patrol secure the border. You let the men and women of ICE remove individuals. You bring some deterrence and consequence back to the system, in addition to about 12 other things you probably need to do all at the same time. And you send a signal to the traffickers and the cartels and others that business as usual will not be the case moving forward, that we're going to disrupt and we're going to design a system that's going to cut down on your trafficking and your smuggling enterprise.
Joe, what would you say the sort of similarities and differences are between what the United States is going through right now and what's happening in Europe?
Well, first let me say, we're this month 100 years since the United States passed a comprehensive immigration crackdown. 1924, the foreign-born population was a little over 14%. Now it's almost 16%, and consistent with American values, we said this situation cannot continue. We passed a law to dramatically restrict the amount of immigration into the United States. And that was legal immigration, which needs to be dealt with. In the past 18 months, we've had over so much illegal immigration that perhaps over almost 60% of the people that are in the country now, newly arrived, are here illegally, and we have all the attendant crime associated with an open border and the illegal immigration that's just not being enforced, to Chad's point. I think the similarities are that the elites for too long lied to their populations about what they were doing and the consequences of what they were doing, and tried to convince people to trust them, that there were no cultural differences, there would be no increase in crime, that this was, consistent with values, the European values, American values. Well, law and order is consistent with European values. It's consistent with American values. And what we see now is the tolerance of those populations has just run out. The dependency upon social service programs, the rise in lawlessness, both here in the United States, this absurd situation of luxury hotels in New York City being filled up petitions being delivered to the mayor of Denver with demands on the part of immigrants. You think about the libertarian wonderland that the United States was in 1924 versus all the social services we have available now and all the demands and the tremendous largesse that the Biden administration has put in place to entice people to come here. I think that the general populations have just had enough of being lied to, and their generosity of spirit has finally broken, and they have to have this stop because their quality of life has deteriorated so much, and their faith in elected leaders to address this honestly has been exhausted.
Kara, that's a good segue to you because you're Director of Tech Policy Center at Heritage Foundation, and if it wasn't for alt media, I would say the numbers in terms of polling would be very, very different. It's only because of YouTube, Rumble, these alternative platforms that people are actually seeing these videos. So that at least offers us some sort of horizon to see that, people are at least waking up because they can get information as opposed to turning to mainstream media, which was telling us even 6 months ago that there was really no problem.
Yeah, you're exactly right. What is the ethos of the mainstream media? Don't believe your eyes and your ears. Don't believe your lying eyes, I guess. And, there have been some really intrepid reporters that have gone down and had these videos that propagated on these platforms looking at the overrunning of the Texas National Guard. That was something where I watched that video on X, which is now part of our alternative platform because of Elon Musk's takeover, I would say. One of the only free speech platforms with a big user base at this point. And being able to see that, I think it sort of signals what Americans are experiencing in their daily lives. And on a personal note, my grandmother's from Mexico, my grandfather's of Latin American extraction, El Salvador, and there used to be the whole assimilation, integration, adopting legitimate American values. And at this point, and it goes with the terrorism issue and the counterterrorism apparatus that should be working against this, at this point, you have people come in and sort of say, no, I'm going to retain everything about the country that I voluntarily left and bring it over here instead of embedding within the fabric and the social fabric of America as well. And I think we saw that in Europe. That I remember listening to those sob stories from the BBC of all the migrant boats in the Mediterranean, and even me with my background, it was 2014. I was like, oh yeah, like help the people out. And yet we're getting reporting out of West Palm Beach saying someone claiming asylum was trying to lure an 11-year-old into, or did manage to do it, and they're committing crime after crime. You have reports way back when there was reporting that Venezuela was opening up its prisons and letting them come over here, and now Daily Wire is saying, yeah, there's a drop in crime in Venezuela, and correlation does not always equal causation, but this matters, and it matters to our security situation. So the more that we can expose this, the better, but we're still not there yet. The problem is only growing.
Chad.
I would just add, I think it's an important point that Kara brings up. I think if you go back 20 years ago, the type of folks coming here, even illegally, were very different. They were sometimes carrying American flags. They were eager to be part of the fabric of the U.S. Today, you see something very different. A lot of them are entering the U.S. carrying their flag of their country. They are upset when Border Patrol does not pick them up within 20 minutes. They are upset when they do not get a plane ticket, a train ticket, or a bus ticket to their place of choice and housing and there's an expectation that they are owed something as they come into this country. And I think in large part it's because of the policies, the campaign that we saw in 16 for the last 3.5 years. And so the types of individuals that are crossing illegally, not all, but the vast majority, are very, very different than we see today. And along with that comes crime, comes a lot of violence, comes other things that I don't know that we saw 20 years ago.
Can I just build on, because we've talked about a lot of the different problems that are created by this unstructured migration, like crime, social services, assimilation. We don't talk enough about the biggest national security threat, and it's actually not terrorism. Everybody's heard of WMD. We don't talk enough about weapons of mass migration. So this is an adversarial power intentionally putting a bunch of people on the road and pushing them in or enticing them into a country. And it's not science fiction, because part of the reason why the European numbers are exactly like you said is Europe has actually seen this happen to them. The Russians hoovered up every person they could find in the Middle East and Central Asia, and they stuck them in Belarus, and they said, walk into Poland, with the idea that they were going to destabilize Poland. We've seen people take masses of Syrian refugees and threaten to send them to West. We've seen people in countries in Africa say, if you don't pay us, we're just going to take these aliens and we're just going to send them to you. So think about a scenario, for example, where China decides, well, you know what? Today's a good day to take Taiwan. And the week before that, they said, let's just pay somebody to send a couple of 100,000 people across the American southern border. So they're dealing with that at the exact moment we invade Taiwan. But here's the other problem, and Chad knows this really well, because this is the major difference between the problem that Chad faced and the problem that President Biden has actually created. Illegal migration to the United States is no longer about north-south population shifts. What has happened under Joe Biden is all the major illegal human trafficking routes have rerouted to send people to the United States. You can go to, in the Middle East, in Asia, and in Africa, and you can go to a travel agent and book your illegal entry into the United States. And so what's happening now is we are seeing these organic routes created through places like Venezuela, where we see permanent population flows from Asia, from Africa, and from the Middle East. And one of that is, if you just let that go, just the numbers are overwhelming. I mean, we're going to be talking about tens of millions of people that would just walk into the United States. But the other thing is you've left yourself wide open for any adversarial power that wants can put a bunch of people on the road and flood them here. And this is a huge, huge problem. So the number one thing that has to happen, and we could border security and kicking people out and everything else, is the first thing you absolutely have to do is you've got to shut down the global routes which are funneling people in the United States.
Well, so to that point, and the polls that you mentioned earlier notwithstanding, what do you think the elites are thinking? I mean, the elites, I suppose, have to live on planet Earth. There are a certain set of Western countries that they might want to live in, and eventually it does seem that you can only live on a hill that's so high for so long before they come for the hill. I mean, what do you think the thought process is there?
Well, I think actually it touches on something that Secretary Wolf had just mentioned. I don't entirely fault every single individual who's coming to these countries. You know who I fault? The politicians in the United States and Europe who lied to them. Let's go back to that debate stage in 2020 that Joe Biden was part of. And they're asked the question by a show of hands. I think it was the first or second debate. It was one of the early ones. They said, by a show of hands, how many of you would provide health care benefits to anyone who crossed this border illegally? Nearly every single hand on that stage for president of the United States, the Democratic Party, went up. It sent a loud and clear message to folks that give it your best shot, come on in because it's going to be okay. Yet what's happening right now? Talking about what James is saying. You have human trafficking that's going on. You have drug trafficking that's going on. I mean, you look at a state like New Hampshire, where I'm from. Right over the border is a city called Lawrence in Massachusetts, not New Hampshire, but in Massachusetts. It's a sanctuary city. If you talk to anyone at CBP, they will tell you that a number of the drugs that come across, that get into states like New Hampshire, come across the southern border. They go through distribution routes to sanctuary cities like Lawrence, Massachusetts, and then they're trucked up and they poison the rest of the communities right around it. That's what's happening in a state like New Hampshire. Those are the consequences we're seeing every single day of these types of international narcotic traffics and human trafficking. And it's all because of this big lie that's been told by politicians in the US and Europe. And you're seeing the same thing in Europe right now. I actually had lunch with a European diplomat last week. We don't see eye to eye on all the issues. I won't out him of where he comes from because I don't want to get him in trouble. He was very candid and actually I think very forthcoming. And he said, look, because, and I think it ties back to your question of like, how's it going to change? Because of what we're seeing right now, these folks don't necessarily live on planet Earth, but they do live under political pressure. And so if the voters start sending a message to politicians that they're not going to accept the status quo on this anymore, they're going to have to be adaptive to it. And so I asked him, I said, what do you expect to happen in the EU elections in June? He says, well, look, conservatives are going to gain some seats in parliament. I said, what's that going to change? And is it going to be rhetoric or is it going to be policy? He said, it's both, which I was actually found pretty surprising. I expected it's probably going to be a bunch of lip service that's given, right? It's easy to adopt the rhetoric, let alone implementing the policy. He said, no. He said, I think Europe's actually going to get walls. We're actually going to have borders. For years, European politicians have said, we don't believe in walls, we don't believe in borders. That's only what certain countries do. We don't believe in that. The problem has gone so bad, and the politics have been reflective of those poor policies so aggressively that even every politician, including those who are currently in office, who've been ignoring it for almost a generation, are going to start supporting some of the policies that we all know can work.
Yeah, so to that point, Chad, are you amazed that Western countries seem unable, or maybe they're coming around now, but have for a long time seemed unable to defend their own values and borders? I was in Hungary and I met with Viktor Orban, who everyone says is this far-right maniac or whatever, and we spent some time together, and all he talked about was he loves his country, he wants his country to be for his people, he wants borders, and I was quite impressed by that, and of course that's in stark contrast to the way he's portrayed in the media.
Shocker.
Right.
Shocker. Legacy media, portrays someone on the right as some caricature or figure, and of course we saw that with former President Trump as well. No, I mean, look, countries that love, or leaders and policymakers that love their country, want to secure their country, want to have national sovereignty, these are not extreme positions. If you go back 20, 25 years ago, even probably less, these were positions that most politicians here in the U.S. and elsewhere embraced. It's only because I think the left and the progressive party have gone so far left that they've tried to paint, look, if you want to have some control over your borders, if you want to understand who's coming into the country, God forbid, you want to actually vet people coming into your country, understand where they're going, understand what the value is that they provide to the country that they're coming. These are not radical positions, but of course, if you are for those, you get painted as being radical. So what I say to that is, yes, I'm radical. I'm going to embrace that all day, every day, because again, and Matt talked about the polling, I think if you look at the majority of Americans or EU folks, right, they want that. This is what they are craving right now, and it could be a reaction to the far left and the progressive of where they've taken those different countries over the last 3 years here in the U.S., or it could just be this is common sense. This is common sense to secure your border, to put immigration and border security protocols in place so that we know what's coming into the country, so we don't have 100,000 Americans dying of fentanyl overdoses, right? And we don't just sit there and say, well, this is a problem, but I'm not really going to do anything about it. Or if you're the Biden administration, you say, I'm not really going to enforce any type of border security controls. I'm going to rely on Mexico and other governments to do that for me, which is, of course, what they're doing, so they can have it both ways. So I would say it doesn't surprise me that the legacy media paints policymakers and paints those that want to have some control, some national sovereignty. I would say that they are at a step with the majority of both Americans and Europeans.
Joe, let me ask you about the domestic side of this, because I see the immigration issue, even when I'm just looking at my own audience and getting the feedback from them, as the biggest wide tent issue right now. I mean, just within the last 5 or 6 days, Donald Trump did a rally in the Bronx, and even MSNBC, when they were asking people why they were there, they weren't talking about, a little bit about economics and that sort of thing, but almost everybody was saying, oh, there's all these new people in our neighborhood. Oh, the crime has gone up. We don't know who these people are. They're getting social services. So do you see an opportunity now for the right to really widen the tent in a way that probably in the last 3 decades they haven't been able to do?
I do. To your point earlier about what are some of the elites thinking, I think there were a lot of people who believed that we could really have open borders, and it was going to be a virtue. In globalism, erasing nationalism is going to work out great. These people are just like ourselves. And there's a tail to that. The numbers have gotten so crazy, and the images have gotten so crazy. And the reality, I think, for a lot of people, a lot of these elites, like Bill Ackman, who watched what happened on Ivy League campuses, including at his alma mater after October 7th. I got to tell you, as somebody who's been concerned about this issue for years, I was shocked to see paraglider stickers on backpacks on college campuses and people celebrating, the October 7th atrocities. So many foreign-born students. That is a change in the culture of those institutions that is so stark. And as a result of us taking so many, just in those little microcosms, taking so many people in from overseas without any concern about having different cultural values, and you see, look at how you can change an institution. Now, they're overwhelmingly liberal-dominated institutions. The professoriate is overwhelmingly liberal, so they're going to be ideological. But you see the consequences of it, and I think even a number of elites are waking up to the consequences of this going on for so long. You can get away with a certain amount of lawlessness, a certain amount of dysfunctional legal immigration for a period of time. But when you've got foreign actors who are taking advantage of this to destabilize us, when you've got presidential candidates saying, doors open, we'll give you anything for free that you want, it's going to catch up to you. And I think that's what the American people are witnessing. We're an incredibly generous people. We have immigrants who are incredibly generous and so appreciative of being here. And everybody across the spectrum is just like, this has gotten completely out of control. It's got to be addressed. And I do think it could be a fundamental realignment and create an opportunity for a crackdown on illegal immigration, if you got a competent team in there who cared about the issue, and also legal immigration. I think you could see something in the next few years. It's complicated to address all the issues that need to get addressed, but I could see that happening because it's well overdue.
Let's stay on that point for a moment because it's something that I talk about constantly. How do we now get these people, the Bill Ackmans that you're talking about, or the Bill Maher's or the Sam Harris's, the sort of non-woke liberal who understands that these are real issues and are seeing the repercussions of all of it? How do you get them to the finish line to vote the right way? Because I see a lot of them breaking, and yet it's always couched in, but I don't know that I'll vote for Trump, or I'm not going to vote for Trump.
Yeah, there's a prodigious amount of throat clearing that happens before they grant the point. You know, I'm probably the worst person to ask because I'm a little black-pilled on that, given I've had, you know, just anecdotally, a friend who moved from Manhattan into Florida, and I was like, oh, amazing, another red voter. And she was like, what are you talking about? Why would I vote red? And they can't seem to really connect what they're seeing on the ground to their voting behaviors. Maybe they'll do it in secret, so they still get invited to the the Midtown and the Georgetown cocktail parties. But I think you're, like you alluded to, when it comes to exposing this, using torrents of information that you don't see if you just watch the Sunday shows like us dorks in the room, right? So if you look at all those platforms, even, and I'm going to go on my privacy thing here, but you look at what's happening in these group signal chats, right? Like people are exposing and generating ideas, and a lot of what is even, and I'll go so far as to say, getting written into law today is built on the backs of these peers coming together, noticing a problem, speaking about it with peer-to-peer networks, encryption, et cetera, using these technologies to speak quietly about it, and then generating more momentum. I think that is a great thing. We should probably see more of it because I'll talk about the terrorism thing as well here. When you look at what the Biden administration is prioritizing when they're talking about terrorism, they're not talking about the illegals who are caught on the Navy bases coming from China that are apprehended 2 to 3 times, according to some reporting, per week nowadays, casing the joint, the Jordanians in Quantico. We saw that too. When they talk about terrorism, they're not talking about a microscope on those guys. They're talking about a microscope on people who, go to traditional Latin Mass in the Richmond Diocese. They're talking about people who spread COVID, misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. In a DHS bulletin in February of 2022, they said this was tantamount to terrorist activity. So they've got their priorities all wrong, but the more that we could talk about it, the more that we could be on stages like this and have this streamed and talk about it, I think people are starting to wake up. To get those elites over the finish line, you just have to, they've been so, as Victor Davis Hanson, a fellow Californian, would say, they've been so insulated from the consequences of their ideologies, but that hill is not that high.
Part of the problem why it's hard to close the deal is because it's really hard to convince people that the strategy in here is a real thing. Because the real strategy is really very simple. It's to create a right of global migration, that anybody in the world can move anybody in the world they want, because the consequence of that is that national governments would be overwhelmed and unable to control that. And then the response to that is we would just have global governance. Now that is really the agenda. it's hard to convince people that that's true because it just sounds so fantastic. But here's the proof of that, is look at how let's just look at the United States, put Europe aside for a second, but look at how American politics has changed over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, immigration was the third rail of politics. You could not get any Democrat or any Republican on any stage to debate this. And the reason for that immigration was demographically was different all over the country. Everybody had different concerns. And it was like, just don't go there. It's just bad politics. And then the Democratic Party then says, well, this is an opportunity for amnesty, right? But if you remember, like 20 years ago, the Democratic Party of the United States said, we want a secure border. They voted for the Secure Fence Act. And this was the deal. Give us amnesty, and we will secure the border. And today, you cannot find a Democrat that believes that securing the border is valid. And so what has driven that massive shift in policy direction? And it is top down. And the reality is if you're on the left, you have to look in a mirror and say, dude, I've been played. That they're not trying to be nice to immigrants. They're not trying to be more humanitarian. They're not trying to give us more workers to help with our economy. They're actually driving an agenda that's actually going to hurt me as an American. That's a hard sell, right? It's like, the guy that, got scammed for millions of dollars, and before he realizes that the Russian girl isn't really coming over to marry him. But that's the state of politics today. I don't know how you break that.
Well, I think we just have to keep talking about it. I mean, it's interesting watching what's going on in the UK right now with the elections about 5 weeks away. A key driver of the collapse in conservative support is their inability not just to deliver on Brexit, but to deliver on their promises to crack down on immigration. Mm-hmm. And the numbers that we see here are equally terrible there for the number of illegal immigrants who have landed there, the number of foreign-born who are on public assistance. I recently had lunch with a friend who had just flown in and had been on the ground in London for maybe 8 hours. Businessman, not terribly involved in politics, and said to me, I haven't been here that long, but it just seems like the British have lost control of this city. Mm-hmm. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, it doesn't seem like it's British anymore. It doesn't seem like the place is being run for the British. There's something else going on. I don't really understand what it is. I see a lot of Ferraris, but I don't see a capital of a British country. And it was just sort of an interesting observation for somebody who had just been in for a few hours. But you hear that complaint all the time, including from immigrants who I talk to, immigrants to the UK who also admit things have gotten out of control and lament the fact that they can't control it, and that Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives have not delivered on their promises to remove people who are there illegally, and also to keep more people from coming into the country.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think how do we get them to change their mind? I think it's tough, but I think, doing this and having folks on the right continue to talk about this. Jim said it, it used to be the third rail. No one wanted to talk about border security, immigration. And I think that's why the left was able to capitalize and to paint a picture in a way. So I think it's really important to say there's an alternative way to do this. All right, and obviously we showed it during the Trump administration, but there are other ideas on how you secure a border, how you continue to be humanitarian, how you continue to allow legal immigration, right? U.S. is one of the most generous countries in the world, and I'm not sure about others, but I get painted as a racist and all this other stuff, and yet I talk about the illegal immigration, right? And then how do you boil that down to individuals living in Kansas and Nebraska and others? I think where this really started to hit home here in the U.S., and I assume it's the same overseas, is the impact on local communities, mm-hmm. right? Mm. It's floods of migrants coming in, taking over a hotel or condominium complex, taxpayer dollars of those cities, the African American, the black community standing up saying, why are our tax dollars going to give benefits to folks who just got here? That is actually an America First approach. They just don't know it yet. That is an America First approach. And so I think more and more of that local impact. I was in Yuma, Arizona on the border recently. We talked about their hospital system. When they had the flood about a year ago, their citizens couldn't get hospital services there. They actually had to drive about 100 miles away because of the influx of illegal immigrants. So there's a lot of impact on local communities, and I think that's a different way to look at. You can talk about the illegal activity. I'm concerned, like Jim is, on that national security threat. I think that's what we should be concerned about. But some people just don't, it doesn't hit them every day. But what does impact them are things that they're seeing in their communities.
Matt, are you at least bullish on the United States' ability to deal with this, even if the federal government won't do anything, at least under the current administration, or is actively exacerbating the problem, that the states, Chad mentioned Texas before, Florida, you take over a road in Florida, which some of the protesters tried to do, and then we found out some of them were illegal. They were there for 11 minutes. That's in stark contrast to what might happen in Washington or in Massachusetts, et cetera. So we have some built-in protections against some of the crime and lawlessness.
Well, first we got to get Chad back in the job. And once we do that, I think that'll fix a lot of problems. But no, and I think this actually ties in with what they were saying before, too, was that the moment this changed as an issue here in the United States, and not just from a policy standpoint, but from a political standpoint, was the moment that Governor DeSantis and Governor Abbott said, this is no longer just going to be our problem, this is an American problem. It's not just the Texas border, it's not just coming across the Florida border, it's an American border that we have to all share in this burden then. If you coming from DC, Joe Biden and Mayorkas, Secretary Mayorkas and the rest of them are going to say it's our problem, well, we're going to show you. And that's when they started sending migrants up to New York, to Chicago, and now you're seeing the outrage from the Ackmans and the rest of them, because it's impacting their life just as much as it's impacting the ranchers down on the southern border who are waking up every single day, going across their farm and trying to find out how many illegal immigrants have died from starvation or lack of water or what have you coming across that border. How many times are they finding bags of drugs dropped on their own property, on American soil, because of illegal immigration? It's now becoming a national issue, and you're seeing the same thing in Europe. This used to be something that everyone talked about with a lot of the nations that are kind of on the border of Western Europe, Germany and Italy. You're now seeing it permeate throughout the rest of Europe, and that's why you're seeing the numbers you're seeing in polls, because people are experiencing this in their everyday lives. It's not just something they're reading in the newspaper. They're actually living it. When you all of a sudden start seeing an illegal immigrant attack folks on a subway in New York City, it totally changes the mindset for someone who's been living in Midtown thinking that this is a problem far, far away in a state I've never been to. It's now impacting their life every single day. It's grown from a regional problem to a national problem or a continental problem in Europe, and that's why you're seeing the polling the way it is.
So, James, since you mentioned some of the intent behind this, and you mentioned Russia and China, what should we be doing differently as it relates to Russia and China, either from an American perspective or a European perspective?
Yeah. So, Chad talked a lot about what we can do to secure the border. What we actually don't talk about enough is giving people reasons to stay home, and this is equally a problem where we get that all wrong. If you look at the influence of Russia, China, and Iran in all these different theaters, they're making life hell for people, and they're giving people more reasons to leave. And you think, well, the United States would be countering that by giving people an opportunity for human flourishing and a reason to stay, and be a better partner for the U.S. and other countries. But if you actually look at what our policies are, they're actually just throwing gasoline on the dumpster fire. And so we could have a long discussion about foreign aid and all these other things which Republicans have done and Democrats, which is equally useless. And we're just throwing money into oligarchs, and it's going nowhere. But this administration has the blessing of actually creating more reasons to put people on the road, other than just saying, just come here and claim asylum. So, and the number one issue is energy. Green transition means one thing if you live in most parts of Africa, Latin America, and vast parts of Asia. It means energy poverty. It means you're almost guaranteed never to get electricity to your village, and almost guaranteed never to get a quality of life. And that is the number, and so this is a reason to leave. And so our economic policies, our energy policies, our regional policies, we're helping make turning the world on fire and giving people an excuse to leave there. So several years ago, they did a one of these Pew poll things, and they asked everybody in the world, how many people want to move to the United States if you could? And the answer was about, I forget, it's about 2 billion or something. But it was, I mean, could you imagine 2 billion people in the United States, right? And that was before Joe Biden became president.
Right.
And so there's almost no aspect of the policy, and I'm not even a Republican, so I don't have a dog in this fight. There's almost no aspect of this administration that isn't throwing fuel on the fire of illegal immigration. And so it's actually not just our immigration and border security policy, it's absolutely our foreign policy and a lot of our domestic policies.
Let me ask you all the same question, because something that comes up on my show a lot is the cultural part of this. That if we bring in people and we don't know what their values are, I think the meme out there for years was that they would sort of become more like us, because that's probably what all of our great-grandparents, or however many generations you are in this country, that's what happened, and no one was given anything, and we all became part of that melting pot. It's the dream of humanity, actually, what we have here, and it's very precious. That doesn't seem to be what this new generation is, or these new people coming in are doing. You sort of hit on that earlier, Chad.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Because I mean, so I'm Italian. I don't know if you noticed. My grandparents, they moved to Little Italy, because what made me think it was a story about how London has changed, right? My grandparents moved to Little Italy, which is maybe, if you actually were in Little Italy in the 1950s, were you in Naples or Little Italy, you couldn't tell the difference. What is the number one thing they wanted? To move out of the Bronx, right? Mm-hmm. and to be with the rest of America. So this model of assimilation and opportunity, that is the distinction. And this is something we're destroying in the United States, but this is something that's absolutely been destroyed in Europe, and something that's reflected in the polls that you guys talk about, because in Europe, the social welfare state has become so powerfully dominant. This greater dependence on Brussels, the inability to innovate, the inability to live your life, the inability of human freedom and flourishing, that is really exacerbating the problem. So when these populations show up there, right, they're just put into the system, and there's no incentive to want to do something different. And, when my parents, and grandparents, this was in America. I mean, it sounds trite, but it's absolutely true. The foundation of Western thing is human flourishing comes from humans taking advantage of human opportunity, and we've been suffocating that in Europe and the United States. So this is really weird, right? So what happens here is Europe actually pioneered this. They pioneered suffocating the human spirit and opportunity. And what we've done is, Joe Biden has imported that to the United States and kind of put it on steroids.
So why do you think, I mean, it's the same question for everybody, why do you think we haven't been able to sell that story better? You all kind of nodded when I said the thing about grandparents. My great-grandparents on both sides came from Eastern Europe. They lived on the Lower East Side, had nothing, not too far from Little Italy. And then over the generations, each generation became more successful. And that's what I hope to hand to my children. Why have we not been able to sell that story in the West?
I'll say it because we're uncomfortable making value judgments and being bold about them. I mean, even we saw it when we were fighting in Afghanistan. I think a lot of us who, were, there in some capacity will say the biggest mistake that we made was transferring our set of values onto the Afghans by saying, oh, they just want freedom. Remember that? George W. Bush, we talk about it at the Heritage Foundation. We went to the mat for that guy. I was in college, but at the same time, I defended him with everything because I was like, yes, people just want justice and freedom. That's not always the case. Sometimes they just want their enemy tribe to be punished. So saying that, every set of peoples and civilizations is like us and equals, I think we should be able to say the United States is objectively better. The United States, where we live, our values, they are wonderful. And as others have said in the State of the Union retorts years ago, there's nowhere else left to go if we lose this place. There's nowhere else left to go. So we need to be able, as Americans, as patriots, and again, second generation here, we need to be able to say, yes, my ancestors chose to come here because it is better. It is objectively better. What we do, how we allow for human flourishing is objectively better than the place that we left. I don't want different countries' flags flying in those protests. I don't want someone of Yemeni extraction speaking at a valedictorian podium saying, you're a colonizer, when everything that she has is because she is here with our values in our system. I saw it in the tech world, biting the hand that feeds them over and over again, thinking they're the locus of power when they thrived under this system, under these peoples. And sovereignty is common sense. You said it, I'll paraphrase. Sovereignty is common sense, and America is good. And we need to be able to say it. That's why it hasn't gotten purchased, because we don't say it enough. America is good and many times better than the alternative.
Yeah, well said. In that line about we have nowhere else to go. I mean, ain't it the truth? I already live in Miami. It's the southern tip of Florida. Like, I guess I could go to Bahamas maybe, but we'll see how long that can last. We only have a couple minutes left, so let me let each one of you guys chime in.
I would say to build on that is I think we've got to look at a border security immigration system that prioritizes Americans' interest. Meaning to say, start evaluating folks that come here legally, of course. What value add do they add to the country? Are they assimilating? Like, I think we've gotten so far away from that over the years and the decades that we need a fundamental re-understanding of how we do that legal immigration piece. How is it that if we want to allow folks to migrate here, to get on their green card, how are they bettering not only U.S. citizens, but obviously the country as a whole? I think if you start with that, everything else sort of starts to fall in place. I think we've gotten away from that. I think we need to come back to that. I think it's a different way to look at all the different visa programs we have, a lottery visa program that doesn't prioritize any of that, and a number of other things. You've got to deal with the illegal immigration or migration. You've got to bring some sanity back to that. I don't think we see that, obviously, under the Biden administration and under some of the recent actions over in the EU either.
Joe, and then Matt, I'll give you the last one.
Yeah, I think for too long, people who talked about the danger of allowing unfettered immigration allowed themselves to be cowed and be attacked as being racist, as being not in touch with American values. And that delayed an honest discussion about these issues for far too long. But now we're in crisis mode, both here and in Europe, and we have to have this conversation. People need to be willing to confront it objectively and have honest conversations about what do we want as a country, what is in the best interest of the United States. Because this thing will have a long tail. I mean, you look at, just leave you with this, like Ilhan Omar's district. That wasn't like that 40 years ago. And how could you ever see that district turning to a sensible representative at this point? That was a result of immigration, full stop, and a group of people that do not want to be assimilated into American society, do not want to move out of that area, are perfectly content to have an enclave unto themselves. That is being talked about in London all the time. Mm-hmm. There was recently a leader of the Muslim community talking about the fact that London will be majority Muslim very soon, and it'll be gone. So I think we need to lead and speak about these things frankly and not be cowed.
Matt, give us a white pill to end. I always try to end my show on a positive note, and on the immigration one, it can be a bit sticky.
I think change is coming. If with the numbers that we're seeing out of Europe this week in the poll that we did, if the numbers we're seeing in American polling right now is true, hope is coming, change is coming. Folks have woken up to it. And what it means is that we're going to finally have elected leaders who are willing to put the interests of their own sovereign nation ahead of what they think is the best interest of the rest of the world. And that's all we can ask all of our individual and national leaders to do, whether it's here, whether it's in Italy, whether it's in France, you name it. That's what every single citizen has a right to expect from the leaders that they elect to represent them. And that's what I think we're going to see a lot more of in the coming years.
Well, I look forward to hearing more from all of you. I thank you guys for watching at home and right here at the Mayflower. And we shall see, I suppose.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate it.